Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and it is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. That's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. And be sure to join our Patreon, which gives you access to our moderated community chats, exclusive TP&R merch, and ad-free episodes, among other benefits. It's our subscribers who help us keep these conversations going, so thank you. Just go to patreon.com/politicsandreligion. That's patreon.com/politicsandreligion. And also it'd be super helpful if you take a minute to write a review of the program. The links to the Patreon and easy way to write that review are all in our show notes. This helps so we can continue having great conversations like the one we're having today with Anne Applebaum. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer at The Atlantic. She's also a senior fellow at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, where she co-leads a project on 21st century disinformation. She's written numerous books, including Gulag, A History, which won the 2004 Pulitzer-prize for general nonfiction. Her most recent books are Twilight of Democracy, an essay on democracy and authoritarianism, and Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World, which we'll be discussing today. Anne's had a renowned career and continues to contribute important reporting and analysis on pivotal stories here in the U.S. and around the world. So I'm really grateful to have her on TP&R with us today. Anne, thank you so much for joining us. How you doing?
Fine. Thanks for having me.
You bet. You bet. I know it's a whirlwind doing these book tours, these virtual book tours. So I really appreciate you having the stamina to hang out with the likes of me. So,
Sure, of course.
yeah. So, I was really curious before we get into the book. I was curious going back to your days as a student at Yale and throughout your career. It seems like you've been drawn to the borderlands, as you refer to it in your first book. I was curious what originally piqued your curiosity and drew you to that region of the world.
So it's always funny to look back on one's motivations in one's 20s, some decades later, and some of them now seem fairly silly to me. The things that I thought I was going to learn by studying Russian, or I was going to achieve by traveling in what then felt like the borderlands, and that would be the territory between Poland and Russia. So it was Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania. The western part of what we used to call the Soviet Union. A lot of it was romantic ideas about forgotten places and trying to tell stories that people didn't know. I mean, it was really an attraction to a part of the world that seemed at that time unknown. And of course, now it's very well known. I mean, Ukraine is very much on the map and is center of a lot of news stories. And Poland, which is where I am right now while I'm speaking to you, is an integrated part of Europe in every conceivable sense of the word. So the romance of forgotten places is now gone. But I suppose what continues to interest me is two things. One is the connection between the past and the present. So the history of places that I've written about. I've written several history books myself, and how that continues to shape the present, and also the idea of dictatorship or authoritarianism or totalitarianism as it continues to evolve. And actually, this book that I've just written is really addressed to that. So as you just described, I wrote several books about Soviet communism. But more recently, I've come to understand that modern dictators are a little bit different. And this book attempts to explain what that is.
Speaking of past and how the past shapes the present, as a historian, if I remember correctly, I think I read that your great grandparents emigrated to the States from what's now Belarus in the mid 1800s. Have you been able to uncover any specifics about your own family story?
I have. I mean, I do know that it's of vast general interest, but but yes, I have some great grandparents and some great great grandparents who left what was then the Tsarist Russia and moved actually to the American South, and some of them wound up in Alabama, which
Oh,
is where my father's from. And that's a long separate story that I will write about actually at some point because I find it interesting. My mother's family took a different route, and they're from, part of them are from what was then Alsace-Lorraine, or what's still Alsace-Lorraine, and they wound up in New Orleans. Um, they, none of them, I should say, none of my grandparents were born in Europe, and nobody in my family spoke any East European languages. So I didn't have any sense of being part of that kind of culture when I was growing up. Quite the contrary. I mean,
hmm.
maybe you could, in some psychological way, trace my interest in the region to some, I don't know, some deep genetic inheritance, but it was really more. It was more, as I said, it was an attraction to the unknown. It was an interest in the Soviet Empire at in the 1980s when it was beginning to end. All those things rather drew me to the region rather than my family.
Well, not speaking of your family, but just my own interests, I would love to learn Russian if for no other reason than to read Dostoevsky or, some Chekhov's comedies in the, in the original language. So have
Well,
you,
funny enough,
are,
that was another one of my original interests, was that I was a great fan of Russian novels when I was in high school, and I wanted to be able to read them in the original. And the funny thing is, I can read Tolstoy. Tolstoy is such a clear writer, and he writes so beautifully that I find him pretty easy to read in Russian. And the writer who I loved the most when I was 18, which is Nabokov, I cannot read because his Russian is so hard and it's very
oh,
convoluted, and he puns in multiple languages, and his vocabulary is very big. So I find him difficult. But I suppose I got halfway there.
it's funny. There's a line in Biloxi Blues where Eugene, the character Eugene, is talking to Arnold, and he says, "What's your favorite book?" And Arnold says, "War and Peace, the third time." And I think if you don't speak Russian or understand Russian, a good translation makes all the difference in the world. But I don't want to digress too much on that.
No, no, I mean,
Um,
actually, but Tolstoy is one of the ones who's easy to translate because he writes, I don't know how to describe this, but he writes like an English person. It's not convoluted, it's very straight sentences. He's very clear, which is an Anglo-Saxon way of writing. And
yeah.
it's often Russian is, this is more than you want to know, but Russian is a language that declines, so endings change, and so you can get these kind of circular sentences like German. And but Tolstoy is all his books are easy to translate.
Yeah. That's interesting because I've read different translations that and the experience was completely different depending on what translation I was reading. But that makes sense. That makes sense. Now, I was also curious about your own writing. Your not just your writing, but your early career. Um, One, how did you learn how to write? But two, where did you there was this adventurous spirit that you had, traversing these far off places of the world to chase stories. Was it a sense that you were in the middle of history being made, that you overcame the dangers that you were facing? Or I'm curious about it all. How did you learn how to write? How did you overcome those risks? All of it.
So I mean, I think learning how to write is like learning how to do anything. You just have to do it a lot. So it's partly about writing a lot. And I was a reporter. I was a foreign correspondent. I there were times when I wrote stories every day. I think also learning how to write is about reading. You all writers start out by copying other writers, and I don't mean plagiarism. I just mean you're inspired by somebody's style, and so you try to write something in their style. And then as you continue to do that, eventually you develop your own style. And I think if you read a lot, then that also helps you write. It's funny. I teach it's a non-credit course at SAIS, at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, on writing. And one of the things I tell students is to find an article, find a columnist you like, or find a journalist who you like, and copy them. So try and write something the way they would write it. And, of course, you're not going to publish something that's a mock-up of somebody else. But the process of learning how to write often is learning how style works and how somebody else's style works. I think that's an important piece of it. And developing your own is about starts with understanding that. I mean, as for traveling, that's also, it's like asking me, why did I originally study Russian? I mean, I was just attracted to the idea of travel and to going to places nobody had been before or were hard to get to. And that drew me first to Russia, then to Ukraine, then to Poland. So, finding myself at a turning point in history wasn't something I'd planned. I didn't know in 1985, which is the first time I went to Russia, that anything was going to change. But yes, it's true that by 1988, 89, 88 is when I moved to Poland to be a freelance journalist. By then, I was, I did understand that things were changing, and understanding it, wanting to understand what it was and what was happening and what were the side effects of it. And what, is something that has occupied me to this day. I mean, I think also the fascination with the Soviet Union and Soviet ideology, which produced 3 long history books, among other things, was also, I was there at the moment when it was falling apart.
Mm.
And I've always spent a lot of time since then trying to understand what was it in the first place and why did people support it. The Gulag, which I wrote a book about, wouldn't have been possible if there hadn't been millions of people who sustained it. And the Ukrainian famine, which I've also written about, wouldn't have been possible without thousands of collaborators. And so who were the collaborators and what was the appeal of the ideology? I mean, that was my motivation for a lot of my history books. And as I said, when you see it ending, you end up asking yourself, well, how did it start? And I think that explains it.
Yeah, yeah. Now, forgive me for asking perhaps ignorant sounding questions, but part of what fascinates me about your writing today, as well as your books, is how did you learn how to do it? Like not just the writing, and I'm curious about your inspirations, who you were reading to learn and develop your own style, but more concretely, how did you learn how to get from Warsaw to Kiev? How do you pronounce it properly? Kiev. Like, how did you learn how to navigate all of these different countries, all of these different territories, as well as gain access to the people? Like, I was just reading a piece a week or two ago where you said, I was speaking with the new prime minister of the UK. How do you navigate those different territories, and how do you gain access to the people to do the actual work, to do the actual reporting and writing?
Well, I mean, some of them are lifetime accumulated experience. So what I was able to do when I was 25 is different from what I can do today. Um, you know, getting around a complicated country is something you do by asking local people,
Mm.
and you always find your way in somehow. You find your way in through a person, through a connection. Even when you're doing archival research, actually, especially in the Soviet Union, or what was the Soviet Union, it's now Russia. Having an archivist or a friend who's worked there before. I mean, even historical work depends on a kind of journalistic effort as well. So you think, okay, I want to get to this institution. Who do I know who can get me there? And sometimes, if you work for a big newspaper or magazine, if you're the New York Times, or in my case, I was very lucky when I was younger to be a correspondent for The Economist. You say The Economist and people say, oh, okay, we've heard of you. We'll talk to you. And then some of it is, again, accumulated friends and years of hanging around. I mean, Keir Starmer, who's the new British Prime Minister, um, I met him because, and this is more than you want to know, but a friend of mine is his biographer. And this has been somebody who I've known for a long time. And so it was really, it was through him and then through other people who I knew in the Labour Party that particular escapade was arranged. But there's maybe he would see me anyway because of The Atlantic, or maybe he would, but it was a you know, you look for the people who have ways in, and you talk to them, and you convince them of whatever, for whatever reason it is that you need to talk to them. But I mean, remember, people want to talk to journalists. I mean, well, they don't always want to talk to journalists. Actually, I don't think Keir Starmer did want to talk to that many journalists, but they have an interest in how you're going to write about them. So really, if you are a person who likes the idea of talking to people and you want to spend your life having interesting conversations, then journalism is the way to go, because it's a profession where that's what you're required to do. I mean, you're meant to be chatty. And I do like that. I mean, I sometimes think I'm very lucky, so my job involves asking interesting people questions and finding out what they think to the degree that I can. And I've always liked doing that. So it suits me.
I finally figured out, after hearing you say that, I finally figured out what I want to do when I grow up. So,
There are other
um,
professions that are similar. I mean, academia has some aspects of that too. You're allowed, if you're an academic, you're allowed to go all kinds of places and ask all kinds of people things.
yeah, yeah.
But it's one of the advantages of journalism.
Yeah, no, in all sincerity, that's what I've loved about this podcasting journey. At the end of the day, a really great use of this medium is when you get interesting people engaged in meaningful conversations. And then the medium is an intimate one where we're inviting others to be a part of this conversation as well. And now with social media, they get to, chip in and tell me the questions that I missed and how else I screwed it up. So, but I did want to talk to you about Autocracy Inc. Just to set the stage, you point out that Autocracy Inc. isn't like military or political alliances from other times and places. So, if you would, what is Autocracy Inc. and what ways are those that are part of it working together to stay in power, promote their system, and damage democracies?
So Autocracy Inc. is what I'm describing in the book is a network. So it's not an alliance and it's not an axis. It's a network. And I was looking for a metaphor to describe it. And the metaphor I came up with was a big international conglomerate, where there are a lot of separate companies. They each have their own business model, but they collaborate where it's necessary. And there is a group of dictatorships who now operate more or less like that. So I'm talking about Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and a host of other weaker countries. So Venezuela, I write about Zimbabwe, partly because I have a friend from there, Burma, Belarus. And these are countries whose political system, they vary a lot. They have very different ideologies. So communist China and nationalist Russia and theocratic Iran are very different from North Korea and Belarus and so on. But they have one common interest, and it's because they have a common enemy. And the enemy is us, and the enemy is the liberal world, the democratic world, however you would like to characterize it. And it partly is about our ideas. So these are political systems in which the leader or the ruling party or the ruling clique has no checks and balances. There is no independent judiciary, there is no media, there's no transparency, and they seek to rule without any restraints. And what liberalism is, what democracy and liberalism are political systems that depend on the idea of restraints and checks and balances and rights. Individuals have rights, sometimes groups have rights. And those ideas are very dangerous to the autocrats. Because it's because they hear those ideas, they hear the idea of rule of law, transparency, democracy, rights, human rights. When they hear those ideas, whether it comes from us or whether it comes from their own oppositions, which also use that language, they seek to push back on it however they can. And whether that's through, whether it's economically or whether it's through information war or whether it's through repression inside their own societies, or even the use of transnational repression, so the attempt to repress their own exiles or dissidents around the world, they're pushing back against that system all the time. And in recent years, there's also a military aspect to this. So the war in Ukraine, there are a number of reasons why it began, but one of the most important reasons is that Russia saw, or thought it saw, an opportunity to crush the liberal democratic aspirations of a state on its border, and a state that they'd been in shared empires with in the past, and whom they did not want to have adopt a Western style or European style political system, because that would be threatening to Putin. So the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014, when young people got up in the Maidan and the square in central Kiev, and they carried signs, calling for end to corruption and democracy in the European Union, Putin understood that as a direct threat to him. Because if people used that language and carried those signs in Russia, then he would have to go, because his political system depends on repressing those ideas. And so increasingly there's a military aspect to this too, and of course it could spread. And again, I can't stress enough, it's not a Cold War. It's not like there's a dividing line, there's no Berlin Wall, there are no good guys on one side, bad guys on the other. Rather, this is a world of autocratic dictators and also autocratic behaviors and practices, some of which we find in our world too. So part of the argument of the book is that they have both grown and enriched themselves partly because of us and with our cooperation, and that they now have some influence over us as well. And that's the core description of the book. And of course, in many ways, and I'm sure we can talk about this, is very different from the dictators of the 20th century, not least because these are very, very rich people. They are billionaires. They have secret funds stored in tax havens all over the world. Their families are very wealthy. Their friends in the business community are very wealthy. And that already gives them more power than autarkic, isolated dictators of the 20th century.
Right. One of the things that became very clear to me, and you've talked about this a little bit already, is that this isn't a war like the wars that we studied in high school history class, where there's a border, although that is involved, like the dispute now between Russia and Ukraine, but it's much more pervasive than that, to the point where you talk about the concept of poisoning ideas, poisoning the idea of democracy, poisoning the idea of freedom of speech, freedom of press, and things like that. How how did those methods come to emerge, and how does China do that? Like, how does China crush and poison an idea for its population?
By attempting to show themselves, and really the autocratic world more broadly, as a haven of safety and stability and security, and by portraying the democratic world as divided, dangerous, and even degenerate. So even sexually degenerate is sometimes the implication. The Russians are more into that than the Chinese are, but they portray their system as something that will protect you, and our system is something that will undermine you, that will maybe steal your culture, steal your traditional way of life, and they can offer something more secure and more safe. And and sometimes this, in Russia, this has taken a very, it's a very clear form. So there was a few years back, there was a study done of what Russians learned about Europe from Russian state television. And, a whole huge range of television programs were surveyed, and statistics were made, and, what kind of programs are there, and what are people learning? And the conclusion was, I'm simplifying it somewhat, was that Russians were being told that Europeans, are, of course, they're unhappy and miserable. Of course of course they dislike their own governments, but also they're being murdered by migrants on the street. Their children are being taken away from them by social workers. Gay propaganda is undermining their marriages and is also stealing their children as well. So there's a series of narratives about Europe that are designed to make Russians afraid of Europe, and also, more importantly, to make them not aspire to be European. So many Russians do feel European. They've been part of European culture for a long time. We just started this conversation talking about Tolstoy. He was somebody whose native language was basically French. I mean, he probably spoke that as often as he spoke Russian. The Russians have been in contact with Europe for millennia. But what Putin needs to do is make sure that Russians don't aspire to what Europeans have, which is, again, the rule of law, transparent systems, rights, at least some democracy. Not every European state is a perfect democracy. At least some free media. And again, not every state has perfect free media. But the idea is to make sure that the Russians don't want that and they don't aspire to it. And so however they can poison it, however they can show Europe as I said, degenerate and dangerous and horrifying and other and different, then that's what they'll do. And that's a project that they started in Russia and that they continued in Europe itself. So they, through proxies, so through far right or sometimes far left political parties, you can often read the same messaging in Europe about the safety and stability of autocracy and the divisiveness and degeneracy of democracy. And of course, there's a version of that inside the United States as well. And not all of that is Russian. I mean, a lot of it is American. You don't need Russians to create those narratives anymore. I mean, I think the Russians had a role in designing the way some of this propaganda works, but it's now much more broadly adapted, and I mean, I think it's now kind of a mutual project. So it's not as if the Russians create things; they just amplify stuff that Americans and Europeans do. But it's not an accident that these ideas emerged, or that they became more popular, or that they're somehow attached to Russia or to other autocratic states, because they saw this as part of their project, that we need to undermine those ideas, to poison them, mostly so that our own people don't admire them or want them.
Yeah, as I was reading the book, I was trying to eschew my tendency to think in a myopic way, but I couldn't help but realize that some of the tactics that were being deployed by Russia and China and some of these members of Autocracy Inc., if you will, are mimic or echo or are very much in line with some of the very same storylines that are being propagated here in the States.
Of
That
course.
even Tim Walz, as governor of Minnesota, part of the attack line was that he passed legislation where the state could kidnap your children if they're some of the very same storylines. Not that there's any truth to it, but there's enough ingredients of truthiness, that they gain traction with a certain part of the population. So
Yeah.
I could, again, I was trying not to think, I was trying to keep a wide lens and learn about our world as opposed to think just about here in the States. But there's definitely a lot of resonance about what's happening here now.
No, I mean, and it's not an accident. I mean, these are narratives whose power, became clear over time, and the power, the Russian propagandists see their power, and the American far right sees their power. The deep fear of your children being stolen is something that is common to all humanity. And so the idea that the state is stealing your children, or that the state is corrupting your children, or I don't know, Governor Walz is corrupting your children, is something that can gain traction, which, as you say, with the right number of both truths and untruths put together in the right way. And again, I can't say it enough. I mean, it's not that the Russians have invented this and thrust it upon us. It's that it's a mutual, it's a joint project, kind of,
Yeah.
invented simultaneously in the U.S. and Russia and again elsewhere. The irony being that the one state which is kidnapping children, and is taking them away from their parents and changing their names, is of course Russia, which kidnaps Ukrainian children, from children's homes, and also from families in occupied Ukraine, brings them to Russia, gives them new names, tries to Russify them, and there's of course a whole international project designed to get them back. But the fake taking away, your children are being stolen is a very prominent far right propaganda line. Yes.
Yeah. The other thing that was striking was the degree to which the rest of the world is complicit in kleptocracy and autocracy. For example, you talk about companies like Microsoft, Yahoo, and Cisco helping to establish the Great Firewall of China, as it's called, or even at one point you were talking about real estate agents who don't ask too many questions in Sussex or Hampshire, the factory owners eager to unload failing businesses in Warren, the bankers in Sioux Falls. What are some of the other ways that the world is, like I said, complicit in Autocracy Inc.?
I think, I give a little bit of the history of this in the book. I mean, so I think in the 90s, there was this idea that any economic relationships with anybody were good because
What was
economic
that expression
integration,
the German chancellor used that it sounded
Handel durch Handel, change, trade brings change, basically.
yeah.
And eventually that became, you know, trade brings democracy. There was this kind of belief that any kind of cooperation is good, any economic integration is good because it will lead to more, we'll have more contact, and then there will be peace, and then eventually our great ideas about democracy will travel from the west to the east as it then was, and that will, bring perpetual peace, and we'll all be happy. I mean, there was a kind of, I'm exaggerating, yeah, but there was a more sophisticated version of that a lot of people accepted, and I should say, including a lot of people in Russia and China, who hoped that economic relationships with the democratic world would open up and democratize their countries. And you could even argue that they did, for a period of time. But what started to happen, certainly in Russia, where, again, I tell the story in the book, is that as a small group of people captured the state, they were able to take state resources, they were able to launder them in the Western world, sometimes bring them back into Russia, sometimes hide them, turn them into big property purchases in London or in the home counties, turn them into strange investments, even in the American and Midwest, as a way of hiding or laundering their money. And our financial systems, allowed them to do it. I mean, we were their partners, or American and European lawyers and accountants and bankers were very happy to work with Russian oligarchs or Chinese oligarchs, in order to do this. And one of the arguments of the book is that one of the ways in which we can push back against the autocratic world is by pushing back against autocratic behaviors, including money laundering, dark money, injecting more transparency into our political system. All those things, I think, have, could have an effect on undermining the autocratic world and also improving our own politics.
Yeah, I do want to ask you about the fight, how we fight against autocracy and autocratic behaviors, as you put it. But first, there was a pivotal moment in recent history, and I'm gonna quote part of your toward the end of your book, uh, a little bit here. You say, in the autumn of 2023, both the European Union and the US Congress found themselves unable to send aid to Ukraine because minorities with deep Russian ties, led respectively by Viktor Orban in Hungary and by a handful of MAGA Republicans in Congress, many acting under the instructions of Donald Trump, blocked the majority and delayed the aid. A narrative promoting Ukraine fatigue spread across the internet, pushed by Russian proxies and Chinese media in multiple languages. What was remarkable about this particular moment is that it was like the first domino to be pushed over, setting off this series of other dominoes of acts of aggression around the world. So, for example, many of us know the date October 7th, 2023 by heart, for tragic reasons. But can you go into more detail into all that was happening at that time?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I don't think these actions were coordinated. There wasn't a secret room where people were,
Right, right, right. Yeah.
were running them. It was just that there was a moment when, if you looked around the world, you could see Autocracy Inc., having its impact on us and seeking to change the way the world works as a group. So there was October the 7th, that was Hamas. Hamas is an Iranian proxy, that was an Iranian project. Later on, you had the Houthis and others shooting at American ships in the Red Sea. You had, at the same time, there was a moment when the Venezuelan dictator, Nicolas Maduro, was talking about invading Guyana. You had a surge of Russian mercenary operations going on in Africa. You had these very strange, very, very strange migration movements. I'm talking to you now from Poland. Right at about that time, we had a series of immigrants were coming to the Polish-Belarusian border, which is for many decades had been a completely empty area. It's actually there's a forest there and not much happening. And the Belarusian dictator began literally importing people from the Middle East, from Iraq and from other places, from Syria, importing them, bringing them to Belarus, taking them in buses to the border and sort of pushing them across the border in large numbers, partly as a way to destabilize Poland and to create another new immigration crisis inside the European Union. So you could see all these things were happening at the same time. There were these multiple attempts going on, either to destabilize European and American democracies, or to destabilize the Middle East, or to prevent Ukraine from having weapons to defend itself. I mean, this is a joint project. There were different actors doing many different things at the same time, creating this sense of polycrisis. But most of it is due to the actions of a few countries.
Mm. So you've been asking a similar question, I think, since at least 2016. If we look at what you describe here, how MAGA Republicans in Congress, acting under the instructions of Donald Trump, blocked the majority. Do you think whether it's Donald Trump being used as an asset by Putin, or MAGA Republicans who blocked the aid to Ukraine, were they just being manipulated like marionettes, or were any of them participating, do you think, more wittingly?
I mean, that's a hard question to answer. So Donald Trump acts in the interests of Donald Trump, and he does things that he thinks are good for him. He doesn't. I think it's hard to describe him as somebody's puppet. I don't think that's how his brain works. But he has also, for a long time, liked the idea of doing deals with dictators. He likes and admires dictators. He liked his meeting with the dictator of North Korea. He talks about openly, has done so many times, about his admiration for Xi Jinping. He likes the fact that Xi Jinping is very powerful and he controls a very large country. He likes and admires Putin. Maybe you remember the body language of him meeting Putin, in which, the president of the United States looks like he's cowering in front of
Yeah.
this little tiny Russian, tin pot dictator. So those are the people who he likes, admires. He doesn't like the idea of the US being part of a democratic alliance or being part of the democratic world. He doesn't see himself or America as the leader of that world. He would rather be doing deals. And my sense is that he has some belief that he will do some kind of deal with Putin. I mean, he says that frequently, and I think it's true that he believes it. I mean, whether it's true that there could be a deal is a lot less likely. I mean, certainly I don't see right now how there would be a deal that could protect the sovereignty of Ukraine. But so he has some idea of himself as a deal maker, and it seems that he wanted to block the aid because he imagined that when he was going to be president, he would do some deal. He would weaken Ukraine, and then, what I was told, and this except this is a rumor and gossip rather than something that I've reported on, but I was told that he eventually relented because there were some fears that Ukraine might lose this summer if it didn't have US aid, because the Europeans, although they have by now given as much as we have, aren't producing weapons and ammunition fast enough, or not yet fast enough. Maybe by next year they could. And so he relented. So I think that was his motivation. Republicans in Congress, there are a lot of, some of them I think are manipulated by Russian propaganda. There's a story there was a story, for example, on social media that was completely false and verifiably false, that President Zelensky of Ukraine had bought 2 yachts, and there were pictures of the yachts were on, like I did Twitter, maybe on Truth Social and other forms of media. Of course, President Zelensky doesn't have any yachts, but the story went wide enough and spread far enough and was tweeted and posted by enough people that when the arguments about aid to Ukraine were being made in the US Senate, Republican senators said, why are we sending this aid to Ukraine when the president is going to use it to buy yachts? So that means that there is influence, so that these propaganda campaigns do have an effect. So if they can affect US senators and change their thinking about America's aid policy, then that's a huge success. Then they've achieved something. So there's that piece of it. I mean, there's another piece which is to do with, there is so much dark money circulating in our political system, and the fact that people don't have to, there's whether it's think tank funding or PAC funding, there's so much of it that can be hidden. That there is probably Russian money in the system somewhere wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, it's so easy to hide money in US politics that it would be really shocking to me if the Russians hadn't found, either through Americans or through Russian Americans or through others, ways of donating to people's campaigns. I would be amazed if they hadn't done that.
Yeah,
Since
I mean,
everybody,
you point out that I think it's 1 in 5 condos in Trump-owned or Trump-branded properties are owned by anonymous
well,
owners.
that's a slightly separate thing. I mean, so then the way that Trump was in a business for his entire career that was heavily impacted by by what you call it dark money or black money or hidden money, because it was popular, because it was so easy for so long to buy residential property in the United States through anonymous companies. That meant that condos in Trump Tower or any Trump property were being bought by anonymous companies. So who were the companies? Were those Russians? Were they Chinese? Were they Malaysians? I mean, were they Americans? Does Trump know who they are? And maybe he does. I mean, we have no idea. All of that, just the existence of that little loophole in American law meant that it was possible to give money to Donald Trump in a way that was not transparent. And of course, this absence of transparency is a characteristic of Autocracy Inc. I mean, the autocratic world is untransparent. We don't know how much money Putin has, or whether it's true, as an Italian told me last weekend, that he has a huge house in Italy that he periodically visits. I mean, we have we can't find out. We don't know, and that's an enormous flaw in our own system.
Yeah. Now, last question about Autocracy Inc. You suggest toward the end of the book that in order to fight against autocracy, it shouldn't necessarily be thought of as, and you've mentioned this, as a war against China or Russia per se, so much as a war against autocratic behaviors wherever they're found. How is that kind of a war waged and won?
So, partly it's waged through fighting kleptocratic practices. Partly it's waged through, and this is a longer conversation, but through putting transparency into the algorithms that run social media. Partly it's waged through making Americans conscious of what's at stake. I mean, that's really actually why I wrote this book and why I was so keen to have it out before the U.S. election, and why I'm really happy to talk about it with anybody who wants to talk about it, because having people be aware of what's at stake and why and how we're being challenged and how the autocratic world is influencing us, I think, I think that you can't fight something until you have identified it and named it, and until you know what it is. So part of the answer is that it's explaining to people what's at stake, and also helping people, well, so let me say it differently. Part of it is also about finding new ways to make the argument for democratic ideas and liberal ideas and for the rule of law. We in our country became very complacent about democracy because we were so successful for a long time. I mean, certainly since the Second World War, but even more so since the end of the Cold War. And it felt like we were successful. And so we didn't have to do anything in particular to make sure that we remained a democracy. We didn't really question we were sort of bored by conversations about NATO and democratic alliances. We didn't really think about what those meant. And I think now is the time to begin taking all those things seriously. Take nothing for granted. Don't take your system for granted. Don't take your alliances for granted, because almost everything can be challenged. And if people aren't engaged in public life, and if they don't have if they don't have goals, then then things could change very fast.
So I do want to indulge in maybe it's not so myopic of a question because it is relevant, and folks who are listening um, have these conversations all the time. I have friends in Bucks County, for example, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, a pivotal county in a swing state, and people in my Bible study, for example, we're in a key U.S. House district. So just as an example, there might be somebody in that household that it has Fox News on all the time, or one of the OANN on all the time. Perhaps that person isn't persuadable, but perhaps their spouse is. So for the spouse or their child who's of voting age now, who might be overhearing, talking points like, well, if Trump was in office, Hamas never would have attacked Israel, or Putin never would have invaded Ukraine. What do you say, maybe not to the person who's tuned into OANN hearing those talking points all the time, but what do you say to your maybe neutral, persuadable, the persuadable spouse that you're having a kitchen table conversation with?
I mean, it depends what that person is interested in. So I don't want to give generic advice, because you would, but you can certainly, I think, talking about the attempt to steal the election in 2020. I think the danger that there could be in another attempt to steal an election in 2024. The risks to our democracy just from that, I mean, that's a good starting point. I mean, I think at the time of January the 6th, I think most people understood what it was. It's true that there's been a lot of forgetting and a lot of propaganda about it since then, but if you can bring people back to their original shock when they saw, a mob sacking the U.S. Capitol, I don't know, for the first time since whenever, 1812, or maybe it happened
Yeah,
during the Civil War. No, I don't think so. It must have been 1812.
yeah,
So that I would think that would be. I mean, I would also draw people's attention to people, the degree to which people around Trump are fascinated by the autocratic world and its ideas. And Viktor Orban, who is someone who he's more the subject of my previous book rather than this one, but who is someone who was an elected leader who then dismantled his country's institutions kind of piece by piece and created what's in effect a one-party state. He's very influential around Trump. He's very influential in this Project 2020, 2025, which is the Heritage Foundation's very detailed description of what a second Trump term would look like. I mean, when I look at that, it looks to me like a Hungarian project. I mean, ask people, do you want to be influenced by what's actually a very poor and rather unsuccessful small state in Central Europe? Is that the right influence for America? Is that who we should be looking to for our ideas? I mean, they're pieces of the story that you can look at. And I think but there's also a positive story. I mean, there's so much that Americans have to be proud of. There's so much that we've achieved, and we've come such a long way in our history, and reminding people of that, asking them, do you want to give up on our achievements? Do you want to turn backwards? I mean, that's what I like about the current Democratic campaign, is that slogan. We've come to a point where we have so much equality, people have rights. There's so much more to do, but do you want to fight the fight against the people who want to go back, or do you want to keep moving forward and make things better? I mean, I don't know. These are just ways in which arguments that I would have with my friends.
yeah. So how are you feeling about the state of the campaign and how the elections are looking for 2024?
So I do not do predictions because I don't feel that I have the talent. I don't have a crystal
No
ball.
rank
Um,
prognostication on your
no,
report?
I
Come
don't. I mean,
on.
I can tell you the cliche thing, which is that it is amazing how much the election has changed in the past few weeks. As we're now speaking, it's just a few weeks after after Harris was named as a candidate, and she turned out to have a lot more political talent than she was credited for, both in the way in which she sewed up the nomination and the way she seemed to be immediately ready to launch a campaign. I'll tell you what I like about the campaign, and I'll tell you what I think is dangerous about it. So what I like is the way in which you now have a group of Democrats who are trying to take back the word freedom. Freedom is a word that is used in American public life in a lot of different ways. And this, by the way, is a topic of a narrative podcast that I've been working on, and
Yes.
will come out in September. It's called Autocracy in America, and it's being published by The Atlantic. And one of our episodes is about the ways in which the word freedom has been used in American history. And sometimes, in particular, it has been used as freedom from the state, freedom to do what you want, freedom even to oppress people, freedom to break the law. I mean, think about the Wild West, or you think about other lawless moments of American history, and sometimes freedom is used in that way. But there is also another way freedom can be used, and it's about, are people who live in a lawless state free? Of course they're not. And if there's no laws, if there's no institutions, then strongest person wins, and everybody else is a slave or is or is subject to them. So real freedom depends on people being healthy and being educated and being able to make their own decisions, and being empowered in various ways by public and private institutions. And I very much like the fact that the Harris-Walz campaign has tried to recapture that meaning of the word freedom. And I hope that I hope that it continues. Of course, the danger is, what I don't want this U.S. election to be is a contest between these different versions. I mean, I don't want really, this is not a partisan issue. We should all want that kind of freedom, and it should be something that Republicans and Democrats and people on the right and people on the left agree about. And so, I don't want this to become freedom and the idea of it to become a political issue. But I admire the speed with which they went with that idea, which is quite a deep idea, and began using it, making ads around it, and giving speeches about it.
Mm. Now, this I have just a few more questions, and this one admittedly might require a whole other podcast conversation or just regular conversation. But you have a way of keeping a really wide lens, focusing so much on what's happening around the world, and there really is a lot that's happening. Are there certain stories that you're paying particularly close attention to? What's happening right now?
Yeah, so I actually am one of these people who believes that to understand the really big picture, you also need to have some deep knowledge of specific small things. And I do in my journalism and history actually as well, I do a lot of very granular reporting, talking to people on the ground, or talking to, it's not just Keir Starmer. It's like, I did several pieces from Ukraine in which I talked to civil society actors or soldiers or so on. But yeah, I'd say there are a few key. I still think the war between Russia and Ukraine, I think is one of the defining clashes of our era, and the result will affect the way the world works for a long time afterwards. And so I think we're speaking at the moment when the Ukrainians are still occupying a part of Russia. This is a huge story that's, I think, been underplayed in the U.S., understandably, because of the election campaign and other concerns. But I watch that very closely. There are actually, in the U.S., there are some House and Senate races I'm watching closely. I'm very interested in a group of people in Congress who came in 2018 very idealistically, as is Abigail Spanberger in Virginia, Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan, and a few others whose campaigns I try to follow. I'm interested in what happened to that generation of idealistic, sometimes veterans, sometimes former national security people who went to Congress because they felt, moved to do it after the election of Trump. So there are a few granular stories that I'm interested in. Well, I mean, I follow things like what happens in Moldova, which is a very specialist interest, which I also think is one of those keys to the region. It's very true that there are a lot of big stories you can understand by looking at the local version of them.
Yeah.
I mean, often,
Yeah.
understanding the politics of your neighborhood or your town or your city can often help a lot in understanding the world. Last year, I went and spent some time in Tennessee, which is not a state I knew well at all. And just to use it as an example, it's a red state that used to be a purple state, right? So it was and the title of the piece was, "Is Tennessee a Democracy?" And it was, of course, slightly tongue in cheek. I mean, of course, Tennessee is a democracy. It's part of the United States and people have rights and so on. But there are also ways in which the Republican Party in Tennessee has so locked up the institutions and made them so inflexible that it's hard to see how you could change them. And again, I told that story in a very granular way. I went to some counties. I talked to a lot of people who are doing politics in Nashville and around there. And I think sometimes I think almost anywhere you live, if you get involved in politics. I mean, actually, a minute ago you said, well, if you're interested, if you care about the election, you should talk to your friends who, or their spouses. But you should also, learn about your local politics. Join a party or work on a campaign or work on a, or not necessarily a political campaign. Work on a local issue or go to a town hall. I mean, often by understanding how the political argument is happening in your space, that will explain for you something about the bigger picture.
Yeah. No, it's true. And as I've gotten to know our elected officials here and our candidates here, it's encouraging to know that just because they have an R or a D or an I in some cases before their name, it doesn't determine everything about them. I happen to be very much opposed to our U.S. Congress member who's a Republican, but partly because he voted to overturn elections in two other states without even understanding what he was voting to overturn. And that was a non-starter for me when early on when he was elected. That said, there's a very inspiring young leader who's running for state senate, the state legislature here, who's also a Republican. But I'm hoping that she represents the future, if there is a future of that party, or at least the future of fiscal conservatives and social libertarians. So yeah, to your point, I've gotten to know some folks here, and maybe it's because I'm an independent. I'm not, but that's part of another conversation. I don't want to keep you here too long, so I'll just ask you a couple more questions. One is what we call the TPNR question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, and perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So that's people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
I think the best way to do it is a version of what I just said. So is to be involved in organizations that are doing something. I mean, just arguing with people is, sometimes it works, but often it doesn't. But working together to build a new community center or to clean up some polluted river, or there are finding institutions and organizations and places where you can work with people. I think that's the best way to overcome the gap. I mean, it's always by doing things that you learn things. And sometimes the just talking is not enough.
Yeah, yeah. No, I have cousins in Israel that were part of this project, and there's a similar story that was covered on a CBS Sunday morning show about building sewage systems that crossed Palestinian neighborhoods and primarily Jewish neighborhoods. And they became friends in the process of building building sewage. They had to figure out where their shit had to go. They had to figure out their shit. So that's one way to do it is shared projects across our differences. So I won't make you ask me any questions because I know you've had a long, unless you really feel compelled to do so. I won't make you do it. But do you want to, or
I was going to say, you said you started this by saying, "Oh, I have the wrong career. I should be asking." But actually, isn't your career asking questions? And why do you like doing it? I mean, I know why I like doing it, but
well, yeah, it is. It is now. Maybe I should have said I was late to the game. I wish I understood this in my late teens or early 20s. But yeah, I've been following folks, certain people's work for a long time, and I'm also, I don't know if burdened is the right way to put it, but in a way, I am burdened by questions I have about the world. So the opportunity to have actual conversations with people like you, people like David Brooks, like David French, um, you know, just it's so encouraging to me. Mona Charen, there's so many people. My friend Lisa Sharon Harper, who just came on for a two-part conversation. It's so enriching, albeit challenging at times, to be able to have conversations with the people where the conversation's been going one way. If I listen to an interview or if I read a book, I have questions. So it's such a gift to be able to ask those questions directly and to be in conversation with some of these folks now. And in some instances, actually have be able to call them pals. That's it's pretty cool. So that's what keeps me going anyway. So before we go, tell us the best place to buy Autocracy Inc. Definitely worth the read. How to keep an eye out for Autocracy in America, the podcast that's coming out with the Atlantic, and how do we make sure to stay up to date with all the great work that you're doing?
well, Autocracy Inc. is available at a bookstore or a book website near you. It's pretty easy to find. It's now in hardback, but it's quite a small, cheap hardback. It's also in Kindle and ebook, and I read the ebook, so it's my voice you'll listen to for better or for worse. Sorry, the audio. Sorry, excuse me, the Audible book.
Yeah,
The audio
yeah.
book is me. Um, uh, you can you can follow me on various forms of social media. I still have a Twitter account, although I have my doubts about Twitter because I just want to stay there and keep flying the flag. But you can follow me on Threads or on LinkedIn or on Facebook, which I use even more rarely actually, but I'm still there. And you can read me at the Atlantic, and you should really subscribe to the Atlantic because I have great colleagues, and they're a really wide range. And the Atlantic, you know, as its organizing principle now, publishes material that goes from the center left to the center right. So you are guaranteed to find stuff that you find annoying, but you might also find stuff that you like, if you're anywhere along that political spectrum. And, people from, are always writing to me, how could the Atlantic publish this outrageous thing? And I say, look, there's if you were of the opposite point of view, you'd find something different outrageous. But so I think it's one of the, aside from leaving aside the fact that I work there, rather, I think it's one of the great institutions right now, if you're interested in this, in crossing divides. And then finally, Autocracy in America is a podcast that I've made together with my friend and colleague Peter Pomerantsev, and it's a 5-part narrative podcast, and it's coming out in September. And I think the trailer is going to be available soon, like within
Okay.
days. And you can find that on the Atlantic website and also wherever you get your podcasts. So all those things are available.
All the things, and we'll be sure to put all those links in the show. Well, not all the links, but easy ways to find you and your work, and Autocracy Inc. and Autocracy in America.
One more
This is
thing.
really,
Sorry, I also
yeah,
have a
yeah.
Substack. I have a Substack, and I put all my Atlantic work and make it all available on the Substack as well. So
Oh, cool.
that's one more thing.
I'll be sure to put the Substack link in the show notes as well. We covered a lot, but is there anything important we haven't discussed you'd like to add?
I mean, there's so many important things we haven't talked about that it's too long a list, but I think that was great. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate you taking the time. I know this is you've been putting in the extra hours, so I really appreciate you squeezing in some time for us. And this was a real treat for me.
Thank you.
And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow the show, write that review, and now you can join the conversation on Patreon, patreon.com/politics and religion. Check it out, subscribe, get the mug, get the tote, get the swag. Really excited about that. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.